Hello everyone, and welcome to the 204th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Daan Lok from Star Wars. If you haven't watched the last Star Wars related episode I made on Adas, I recently announced that I'll be making Star Wars videos every week in addition to my regular episodes. And to learn more about why, I encourage you to go over and watch that episode. But as you can tell, this episode is going to be on Daan Lok, a man who appears in the Dawn of the Jedi comic book series, and is a man who I believe we can reliably claim to be the very first Dark Jedi, as you could also probably tell by the thumbnail. I don't really do sneak peeks too often, but the next episode on a Star Wars character is going to be centered around Zesh, a Force Hound that I mentioned in the Rakata episode, and will be mentioning here a few times as well, that also appears in the same comic book series. But there's actually another villain and group I wanted to talk about before Daegen and Zesh, Daly and Brock and the Stargazers, who appear in the novel Dawn of the Jedi, Into the Void, as that story takes place a few years before Daegen and Zesh's story does in the Dawn of the Jedi comic book series, and actually leads into it. But I haven't had a chance to read that book yet, so that will be our final Star Wars video for November. And we'll go ahead and get Daegen and Zesh's episodes out of the way first. But before we start talking about Daegen, let's first talk about our sponsor for this video, Delete Me. Everywhere you go now, someone is looking to get your email or your phone number out of you. And while it's often a necessity to give out this information to various people and companies, you never really know whether or not the information you give out to someone is going to stay with them or be used elsewhere. But Vile, where could that information be going, you might be asking yourself? Why, to data brokers, of course. People who buy and sell your information to spammers and scammers, who then bombard you with unwanted emails, text messages, and phone calls. And worse still, with access to your data, they can even steal your identity or make you vulnerable to stalkers. They can find this information in places you wouldn't expect, like by easily accessing military records for active service members and veterans, or even through genealogy websites, which can list all sorts of information about your family members from the youngest to the oldest, which is concerning to say the least. In 2023 alone, the FTC received 5.7 million total fraud and identity theft reports, and those numbers only increase with each passing year, so we could all use a bit more protection in this regard. And Delete Me provides excellent protection from these malefactors. Delete Me doesn't just work for you to remove any current threats to your information, but they're always on alert for more, and by looking through my data reports, I can see that they found 40 companies who currently have my information and are selling that information to people looking to make my life miserable and expose me to hackers. And unfortunately, I know those numbers are only going to increase, so I'm glad to have Delete Me in my corner to remove my data from these websites. You can enjoy some added protection as well though by going to joindeleteme.com/vile or by clicking the link in the description. And when you get there, be sure to use the code VILE to get 20% off any US consumer packages. That's joindeleteme.com/vile and enter the code VILE at checkout to get 20% off your purchase. Thank you Delete Me for sponsoring this video. Now without further ado, let's begin. I touched on this briefly in the Rakata video, but the history of the Jedi goes back far longer than you might think. Tens of thousands of years before the Battle of Yavin, the Qua, the species who built the Infinity Gates and brought knowledge of the Force to countless species throughout the galaxy, also constructed 9 pyramidal ships called the Thoyor, the largest of which they left on the planet Tython, and they scattered the other 8 across different planets throughout the galaxy, those being Ando Prime, Kashyyyk, Dathomir, Ryloth, Manan, and 3 other unknown planets. The Thoyor lay dormant on each of these planets until the year 36,453 BBY, tended to as sacred objects by the species of each of these planets, and when they awoke, those Force-sensitive among them heeded their call and entered the Thoyor. Each Thoyor traveled across the galaxy collecting other Force-sensitives from various planets, including humans, Sith, Ikachi, Cathar, Zabrak, Miraluka, Devaronians, Nogri, Kurivar, Kravaki, Celestins, and many others. And after they had collected enough individuals, they headed to Tython to gather around the 9th and largest Thoyor. Here on this temperate and Force-rich world, these people immediately understood what they were meant to do, study the Force, and master the abilities it granted them. And from this understanding was born the Jedi Order. That's Jedi spelled J-E-D-A-I-I, the first iteration of the Order that we all know so well. However, unlike the Jedi were founded on the principle of balance, with both the light and the dark central to maintaining that balance, concepts which they named Ashla and Bogan respectively after the twin moons of Tython. Observing the world around them, they saw 2 moons in the one sky, light Ashla and dark Bogan, and they understood the dual aspects to the Force, light and dark. The light defined the dark, as the dark did the light. When balance was not maintained, Tython reacted to the imbalance with severe storms and quakes. And so the travelers defined themselves, ever seeking a balance. They became the Jedi, a Daibendu term meaning mystic center. Only through the harmony of balance could the Jedi maintain a peaceful world. And to aid them in their never-ending purpose, the Jedi created a code, one that was much akin to the Jedi and Sith orders that would come after them. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no fear, there is power. I am the heart of the Force. I am the revealing fire of light. I am the mystery of darkness, in balance with chaos and harmony, immortal in the Force. Now, much like the Jedi also built temples, and these temples were then constructed around the Thoyor, each one specializing in some aspect of the study of the Force. Kaleth, the Temple of Knowledge, was perched over a Force nexus, and it was for all intents and purposes the central temple of the Order, as this was where the Jedi would meet to discuss important matters whenever they arose. Bodhi, the Temple of Arts, was located on verdant greens near pleasant forests, and it was where the Jedi would go to study the Force as manifested through the arts, which included writing, calligraphy, dancing, drawing, sculpting, cooking, music, and theater. Maharakesh, located in the deep ocean, was the Temple of Healing, and here is where the Jedi would focus on the healing arts both with and without the Force. Qui-Gon Kesh was the Temple of Force Skills, located within an area known as the Silent Desert, and the relative silence here aided the Jedi in honing their abilities in mental and sensory uses of the Force. Stav Kesh, the Temple of Martial Arts, is of course where the Jedi would go to hone their physical prowess. Padawan Kesh was, as many of you could guess, the temple where initiates into the Order were trained before being assigned to a master to be trained further. Akar Kesh, the Temple of Balance, was arguably the most important temple on Tython. Centered around the original Thoyor, the open-air Akar Kesh was used as a place for quiet, introspective contemplation, and here is where the balancing of the light and dark was taught. Vortepe, the Forge, was built over an active volcano, and it was here that members of the Jedi would study ways in which the Force could be manifested physically. And there was a saying here, whatever Anil Kesh can imagine, Vortepe can make real, which brings us to our last temple, Anil Kesh. A moment ago, I mentioned that Akar Kesh was arguably the most important temple on Tython, but Anil Kesh, as far as the story of Daegen Lok goes, is the most important temple on Tython. Anil Kesh was the Temple of Science, and while the research done by the Jedi here at this temple likely resulted in numerous Force-based innovations, what made it so important was its location, not what it produced. Anil Kesh was built atop the chasm, a deep gorge in Tython's surface that interferes with Jedi senses, and the stronger you were in the Force, the more it would affect you. But the chasm beneath was so deep that no one had ever reached the bottom, and many a Jedi had gone mad trying to delve into its secrets, which brings us to our subject of this video, Daegen Lok. As time passed on Tython and the Order evolved, many people who weren't Force sensitive were born to the Jedi, and because Tython was such a tumultuous world, those without access to the Force succumbed to its natural fervor, and with the non-Force sensitive outnumbering the Force sensitive 10 to 1, the Jedi were incapable of protecting them all. So, these non-Force sensitives went out to the other planets in the Tython system and colonized them. Conflicts would arise on these planets, and the Jedi would intervene when required, the most recent of which at the time the story of Dawn of the Jedi takes place was a conflict called the Despot War. Shikakwa, the seventh planet from the sun in the Tython system, was ruled by gangster clans known as the Nine Houses, and 10 years before this story begins, a Twi'lek woman by the name of Hadia declared herself queen and united these clans, afterwards forming a formidable army that aimed to conquer all of the Tython system. This despot queen, as she would come to be known, carved out a sizable kingdom for herself and ended many lives in the process, and if it weren't for Daegen Lok, she might have succeeded in conquering all of the Tython system. Lok was then and would remain evermore a confident, charismatic, and adventurous man who wasn't afraid of doing whatever it took when it came to fighting for causes he believed in. A man whose personality in many ways was a mixture of Han Solo's and Anakin Skywalker's before his fall to the dark side. Losing his brother and father to Hadia's forces in the war, Lok desired to exact his revenge upon Hadia and her so-called kingdom, and so he contacted one of the crime barons of Shikakwa, Baron Volnos Rio, and managed to infiltrate Hadia's inner circle with his help. Posing as a disgruntled former Jedi Ranger, Lok made his way into the good graces of Hadia herself, eventually becoming her lover. While he had grown to care for her, when he, Hadia, and her forces began the invasion of Tython, Lok was reminded of his duty and slew Hadia in her tent one night, and with their leader gone, Hadia's forces quickly dissolved and the war came to a swift end. As the hero of the Despot War, Lok earned honors and praise from his fellow Jedi, but like so many who have come back from war only to be thrust into a life of serenity and complacency, Lok desired to taste once again the thrill of adventure that he had felt whilst operating in the Despot War. And so he convinced his longtime friend, Hawk Rio, brother of Baron Volnos Rio, to accompany him to Anil Kesh so they might descend into the forbidden chasm below the temple and discover its secrets. While Hawk and Daegen wouldn't succumb to the chasm's power, nor would they go completely mad, they were both granted a shared vision that would forever alter their destinies and prove to be both a blessing and a curse that the Jedi Council at the time perceived only as the madness typical of ones who have ventured into the chasm. In their visions, Hawk and Daegen saw the coming of a masked warrior with a single red eye who would serve as a harbinger for an invasion by a strange alien race who wielded swords of fire. But in that same vision, both of them saw Lok leading an army of Jedi armed with the same swords against these invaders, so they might be driven away from the Tython system. And importantly, Hawk and Daegen emphasized that it was a commitment to the dark side of the Force that was to be the key to their victory in this fated scenario. Assuming that Hawk and Daegen had gone mad, the Jedi, who strived to maintain balance between the dark and the light at all times, decided that it was all too appropriate for the dark-obsessed Hawk and Daegen to spend some time reflecting on their imbalance on the dark moon of Bogan, where many a Jedi who have failed to maintain the balance have been sent to meditate on their issues, so they might return to the Jedi fold one day. Hawk eventually found peace and was allowed to return to Tython and rejoin the Jedi. But Daegen was so convinced that his vision was truth that there was nothing that could convince him otherwise. If you've watched my video on the Rakata, you'll know that the man with the red eye these two saw in their vision was the Force Hound Zesh, and the alien beings with their swords of fire were the Rakata themselves. And this vision wasn't just a glimpse into a possible future, but a look into a future that was certain to play out. And it's for this reason that this vision was both a blessing and a curse. As we'll soon discuss, Lok and Hawk's vision, but particularly Lok's insistence that this vision was a very real warning that the Jedi must heed if they were to survive the coming onslaught, is what allowed the Jedi to prepare for the coming invasion and eventually fend off the Rakata. And as the Force sabers the Rakata used were powered by the dark side, it turned out to be true that pushing themselves more towards darkness would be the key to winning this war, as using the Rakata's own armaments against them was a central component of their victory. Despite this, many issues were created when Daegen Lok managed to convince the Jedi to move towards the dark side. Many of you will likely be familiar with an old Jedi adage that Master Yoda was fond of repeating. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. Embracing one's fears has often, if not always, been the first step a person takes when succumbing to the influence of the dark side. Fear of one's mortality, fear of being powerless, fear of losing the ones you love. It's natural to fear things, but it's when we let our fear rule our worlds that it becomes a problem. And that's exactly what happened to Daegen Lok. He so feared his vision that he let himself become convinced that to embrace darkness was the only way to ensure that he could protect everything he held dear. And while I stated a moment ago that would help the Jedi win their war against the Rakata, a band-aid solution like the one Daegen Lok convinced the Jedi to implement birthed a whole host of other problems. After Zesh arrived in the Tython system, and Daegen's vision began to become truth rather than fantasy, he, with the help of Zesh, managed to escape from Bogan and began recruiting the remnants of Hadia's inner circle and army on the planet Nox, in the process warring with his former comrades as he attempted to outmaneuver them, which eventually resulted in a duel with his former friend Hawk Rio, a duel that ended with Hawk losing one of his legs. Daegen and Zesh were apprehended after this happened and returned to Bogan, but once the Rakatan invasion began in earnest, both Daegen and Zesh were called back to help lead the effort against these invaders, and he, along with Zesh, would be instrumental in guiding the Jedi forces in this war, and ultimately ending the war when Zesh prevented the leader of the Rakatan forces, Praetor Skalnas, from reaching the Infinity Gate that lay at the bottom of the chasm of Anil Kesh, the true source of its mysterious power, and a mechanism that would have allowed the Infinite Empire to truly become infinite. This is essentially where the story of Daegen Lok ends, as he never appears again in person in any other related media. However, that doesn't mean that his influence over the Jedi ended. Many of the Jedi were convinced that adhering more so to the dark than the light was wise, which then resulted in a civil war between the followers of Daegen's teachings and the Jedi Council and their loyalists 11 years after the war with the Rakata ended. A war known as the Force War, one that ended with a Force cataclysm that rendered Tython uninhabitable and caused the formation of the Jedi Order that we know today, as well as the exile of the followers of Daegen Lok to the Outer Rim before they'd rejoin their erstwhile comrades on Ossus some 730 years later. While Lok's influence caused the destruction of the Jedi Order, as well as the deaths of countless of their number, and likely many innocents, his actions left a long-lasting influence in that he forever convinced the newly formed Jedi Order that to adhere strictly to the light was the path to achieving true balance, which subsequently ensured that those who clung to the light would forevermore be at war with those who lay in the dark. And while it may have been inevitable that the Jedi would discover just how incompatible melding the dark into one's life is to existence, it still stands that Daegen and his followers were the driving force behind the Jedi reaching this conclusion, not to mention that their act of defiance would set the stage and serve as inspiration for the many schisms that occurred within the Jedi Order over the course of the next 25,000 years. Perhaps when the Rakata came to call on the Tython system, the Jedi needed just a small amount of imbalance to operate the Force sabers in order to ensure their survival. But it's not necessarily true that the Jedi needed to immerse themselves in the dark side to fight off the Rakata. And because of Daegen's insistence that they did, thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives as the followers of Bogan clashed with those of Ashla. and as the first instigator of a now long and storied history of Jedi flirting with the dark, who go on to cause immense harm to not just their order, but the galaxy at large, Daegen Lok is more than deserving of being called the first Dark Jedi, and a man whose storied legacy would be mired in evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Daegen Lok? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.